This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are completely fictional. My husband said, "You are not invited," and used my credit card. So the bank called. During the reception, hook. The ballroom doors were wide open. Gold light poured into the hallway. Claire Bennett stood frozen in her heels, carry-on still in her hand, jet lag still behind her eyes, and watched her husband of 14 years stand at an altar in a tuxedo she had never seen, smiling at a woman she had never met. She took one step forward. Nathan's eyes found hers across the crowd. He didn't flinch, didn't go pale, didn't even have the decency to look afraid. He looked at her the way you look at someone who wandered into the wrong room by mistake, a small, irritated flicker. And then he said it, loud enough for the people nearest the door to hear. "You're not invited, Claire. Don't make a scene." 14 years, and that was all she got. If this story already has your blood pressure rising, you're exactly who I made this for. Hit that like button right now, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Because what happens next inside that ballroom, and what Claire does with a single phone call, is going to stay with you for a long time. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The flight from Chicago had been delayed twice. Claire Bennett had spent 4 hours in O'Hare sitting in a plastic chair near a charging station, shoes off, laptop open, answering emails from a merger negotiation that had already eaten most of her week. She was exhausted in the specific way that comes not from physical tiredness, but from being sharp and alert for too many hours in a row. The kind of tired where the back of your skull aches and your eyes feel slightly too dry for their sockets. She was supposed to stay one more night in Chicago. That had been the plan. The hotel was paid for, her morning meeting had been scheduled for 8 a.m., and Nathan had texted her 2 days ago asking what time her flight home would be on Saturday. She had written back, Saturday afternoon, probably around 3, but the merger deal closed faster than anyone expected. Her client shook hands at 6 p.m., the contracts went to legal, and Claire's work was done. She rebooked the flight herself, didn't think twice about it, and sent Nathan a text as she was boarding. "Coming home tonight, wrapping up early, don't wait up." He didn't respond. She assumed he was asleep. Nathan went to bed early on weeknights, always had, ever since his days as a junior associate pulling long hours at the firm. He was deliberate about his sleep schedule in the way that people who are rigid about routines often are. She didn't find it strange that he didn't answer. She landed at JFK at 10:48 p.m. The cab ride from the airport took 35 minutes. She tipped the driver well because he didn't talk, and she was grateful for the silence. The city blurred past the window, and she let her head rest against the glass and thought about nothing in particular. The merger, the hotel breakfast she hadn't eaten, whether there was anything left in the refrigerator at home. The cab pulled up in front of their building on the Upper West Side. Claire got out, pulled her carry-on from the trunk, and was about to head inside when she remembered she'd promised her colleague Diane a printed copy of the final term sheet by Monday. She'd left the physical file inside the cab and was halfway back to the curb before she realized the driver had already pulled into traffic. She exhaled slowly. The building's front desk had a printer she could use if she emailed herself the document, but the business center at the Aldwyn, the hotel 2 blocks east where she'd attended a conference last spring, was open late and had a better machine. She'd get it done there, be home in 20 minutes. It wasn't a decision, it was barely a thought. She wheeled her bag east along the sidewalk. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside. The Aldwyn was one of those Manhattan hotels that tried very hard to look like it wasn't trying hard. Dark wood paneling, low lighting, leather chairs arranged in clusters near the bar, floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budgets. Claire had been to 3 or 4 client events here over the years. She knew the lobby well enough to walk through it without looking. She was almost to the business center hallway when the sound hit her. Music. Live music, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Strings, something formal and slow, the kind of thing played at black tie events. A string quartet, maybe. Through the far corridor, she could see light spilling from beneath closed double doors, and she registered it as some kind of gala or corporate event and thought nothing more of it. Then the doors opened. A waiter walked out carrying an empty tray, and for the 3 seconds the doors were open, Claire saw the room. She saw the arch of white flowers at the far end of the ballroom. She saw the rows of guests in formal clothing. She saw the candles and the draped fabric and the towering floral centerpieces on round tables, and she saw, at the center of all of it, a man standing at the altar in a charcoal tuxedo. She stopped walking. Her brain did what brains do in moments they're not prepared for. It reached for the most reasonable explanation first. Someone else's wedding, a function she had no connection to. She turned her head to look at the sign near the entrance, one of those elegant display boards with gold lettering on a white background, the kind hotels use to announce events. She read it once, then she read it again. The Cole Hart Wedding Reception, Grand Ballroom, tonight, Cole, Nathan Cole. She thought, that's a coincidence, that's a strange coincidence, but her feet were already moving toward the doors. Not running, not rushing, just moving, the way your body sometimes decides things before your mind catches up. She pulled the door open just enough to see inside, just enough to get a clear line of sight to the altar. The man in the charcoal tuxedo turned slightly to say something to the officiant, and she saw his profile. The jaw, the hairline, the particular way he stood with his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, a habit he'd had since the old shoulder injury from a college tennis tournament 22 years ago. It was Nathan. It was her husband. Claire stood at the back of the ballroom and watched Nathan Cole prepare to marry a woman who was not her. The woman, Vivian Hart, she would learn later, was standing at his side in a dress that probably cost $15,000, ivory with a structured bodice, her dark hair pulled back, a cascade of small diamonds at her throat. She was younger than Claire by maybe 8 or 9 years. She was laughing at something the officiant had said, her hand resting on Nathan's arm, easy and familiar. Claire felt her carry-on handle go slick in her grip. She was not a woman who fell apart in public. Her career had required her to sit across from men twice her age and size who were furious about deals going against them, and she had learned to keep her face and her voice in alignment regardless of what was happening underneath. She had learned it so well that sometimes she forgot there was an underneath at all. But her hands were shaking. She became aware of them, the way you sometimes become aware of something only after it's already happening. Her right hand, the one on the carry-on handle, was trembling slightly. She pressed her fingers together and held still, and breathed through her nose once, slowly. Nathan's eyes swept the back of the room as a guest turned to say something to the person beside them, and that movement, that random shift of attention, landed on the doorway. On Claire. She watched his face register her presence. It happened in about 2 seconds. The slight widening of the eyes, the adjustment of posture, the flicker of something. Not guilt, not panic, nothing that simple. It was more like the expression of a man calculating the fastest route around an obstacle. He said something quietly to Vivian, excused himself from the altar with a practiced ease that made Claire's stomach turn, and walked down the side of the room toward her. Not rushing. Walking steadily, the way he walked into depositions. He reached the doorway and stepped into the corridor and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. They stood in the hallway. Claire waited. She had learned over many years of difficult negotiations that the first person to speak loses ground. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, controlled, the voice he used when he was working. "I was going to the business center," Claire said. He exhaled once through his nose. "You said you were coming home tomorrow. I texted you." "I didn't check my phone." A pause. "You need to leave." Something moved through Claire's chest. Not quite pain, not quite anger, something more like the sensation of a very large thing settling into place. The way you feel when you've been fighting the truth of something for a while and it finally stops letting you fight it. "Nathan," she said, "what is happening right now?" "Don't do this." "Don't do what?" "Ask a question?" "Don't make a scene." His eyes went briefly to the ballroom doors. "This is not the time or the place." "This is your wedding," Claire said, and the word came out of her mouth flat and strange, like she was saying it in a language she was still learning. "Inside that room, with another woman." "Claire, are you married to me?" "We can talk about this tomorrow." "Are you still legally married to me, Nathan?" He looked at her for a long moment. There was no anguish in his face, no remorse working its way to the surface. His expression was the expression of a man who had prepared for this possibility, had constructed a response to it, and was now simply executing the response. "You're not invited," he said. "Please don't make this into something embarrassing." He turned and walked back into the ballroom. The door swung shut. Claire stood in the corridor for a while. She didn't know exactly how long, long enough for two waitstaff to walk past her with trays and one to ask if she was okay, and she said yes, she was fine, and her voice was steady when she said it. She found a bench near the elevator bank and sat down on it and put her carry-on in front of her and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the carpet. The carpet was patterned in a dark gold and cream geometric design. She looked at it and breathed. 14 years. She had met Nathan Cole at a bar in Midtown during a snowstorm. He was a second-year associate at a law firm, broke enough to wince at the drink prices, but too proud to suggest they go somewhere cheaper. She was a junior analyst at a financial firm working 70-hour weeks, wearing a blazer she'd bought at a discount and hoped nobody noticed. They'd talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular. She had not expected to call him again. And then she had. And then another year passed, and another, and they got married in a small ceremony in Vermont with 40 people and rented folding chairs and a cake that was too sweet. She had paid for most of that wedding herself. Nathan was between jobs at the time. He'd left a firm that was going under and hadn't landed the next position yet. She hadn't made a thing of it. She paid for a lot of things in those years and hadn't made a thing of any of it. She thought about that now. She sat on the bench and thought about the timeline. Not emotionally, not yet. That would come later in the privacy of somewhere no one could see her, but practically, logistically. When had this started? How long had Vivian Hart been in Nathan's life? How long had Nathan been building a second life inside the edges of the first one? And then another thought arrived, quieter and more dangerous. How had he paid for all of this? The business center was empty at this hour. Claire sat down at one of the terminals, opened a browser, and logged into her financial accounts. She was methodical about money in the way people are when they've built everything they have themselves and have never once had the luxury of carelessness. She checked her accounts routinely, knew her balances by heart within a few $100s, monitored her statements every 2 weeks. She had not checked since Monday. There were 11 transactions she didn't recognize, not small ones. A charge to a luxury floral company in the amount of $14,000. A payment to a catering deposit company? $6,000. A jewelry purchase. She recognized the jeweler's name from the receipt, a high-end boutique on the Upper East Side, $22,400. Hotel venue deposit. Printed invitations, specialty lighting. She scrolled down and down. Her hand was not shaking anymore. It had stopped shaking sometime in the last few minutes and had gone very still, which was, if anything, more unsettling. Nathan had a secondary access card on one of her accounts. A business account, technically, one she used for professional expenses, which he had legitimate access to for household things, emergencies, the occasional shared expense they hadn't bothered to separate properly after the last financial reorganization. She had added him 3 years ago when he was dealing with a period of reduced income, and they'd agreed it was easier to work from one pool temporarily. Temporarily. She sat very still and looked at the screen. He had spent $94,000. $94,000 of her money on a wedding to another woman. In the ballroom 2 floors above her, Claire closed the browser. She sat in the business center of the Aldwyn Hotel in Manhattan at 11:22 p.m. on a Thursday night with a carry-on at her feet and a flight tag still on her wrist. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not going to cry. She had not cried in a board meeting when a deal she spent 8 months building collapsed in an afternoon, and she was not going to cry now in a hotel business center because a man she had trusted had tried to erase her. She was going to do what she always did. She was going to handle it. She took out her phone. She called Rachel Monroe first. Rachel was not just her attorney. Rachel was the kind of lawyer who answered the phone at 11:30 at night, not because she was always on, but because she understood that some things could not wait until office hours. And the distinction between those things and ordinary things was something she had developed an instinct for over 25 years of practice. Claire said, "I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to not ask me how I'm feeling." Rachel said, "Okay, go." Claire told her. All of it, the hotel, the ballroom, Nathan's face, the charges on the account, $94,000. The wedding happening right now, above her head, in the grand ballroom of the Aldwyn. There was a pause, then Rachel said, "Don't touch the account, don't move anything, and don't transfer anything. Send me screenshots of the transactions right now, and then call your private banker. What's his name, Daniel?" "Daniel Pierce." "Call him next. Tell him you're disputing unauthorized charges on the account. Tell him you want the account flagged and the transactions reviewed. Don't say fraud yet. Let him use that word first." "Understood." And Claire, a beat. Where are you right now? Business center, same hotel. Stay there. Don't go back to that ballroom. Do what I said and let the process do the work. Claire said she understood. She sent the screenshots. She called Daniel Pierce, who answered on the fourth ring, groggy but alert. And when she explained what she'd found on the account, his voice sharpened quickly into the professional register that meant he was taking notes. I'm flagging the account now, he said. Given the amount and the pattern of spending in a compressed time window, this is going to trigger an automatic review. The bank may need to reach the account holder of record before processing can continue on any pending charges. Nathan Cole is a secondary authorized user, Claire said, not the account holder. Understood, Daniel said. I'll note that. What happens to any pending payments? If there are vendors with charges still processing, they may be paused pending review. Depending on timing, the bank's fraud line may reach out to both the primary holder and the secondary user. Claire thought about the catering company, the venue, the vendors connected to the wedding upstairs, all of them waiting on final payments, deposits clearing, balances settled. She thought about Nathan standing at that altar. She said, "Please proceed with the review." She went to the women's restroom near the elevator bank and stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked exactly like herself, which for some reason was disorienting. She expected to look different, to look like someone whose life had just been dismantled. But her face was her face, composed, a little tired, the mascara still mostly intact. She turned on the cold water and held her wrists under it for a while, the way her mother used to tell her to do when she was young and overwhelmed. Her mother had been a practical woman. Not warm, exactly, but solid. The kind of woman who got things done and expected the same of her children. Claire was 12 when her father left, and her mother sat her down at the kitchen table and said, very plainly, "We're going to have less money for a while, so you're going to need to understand how money works." And she had meant it. By the time Claire was 15, she understood compound interest and credit scores, and why you never let someone else's name on an account you couldn't afford to lose. She had forgotten that lesson somewhere, or she had trusted it away. She dried her hands. She went back to the business center. She opened her email and began composing a document. Notes, timestamps, screenshots, everything. Not because Rachel had asked her to, but because organizing information was how she processed things, and because she already understood, with the cold clarity that her career had built into her, that everything that happened from this moment forward was going to matter. She heard the string quartet stop playing upstairs. She heard faintly the sound of applause. She kept typing. Somewhere above her, Nathan Cole was being announced as a married man for the second time. He had no idea that his phone was about to ring. He had no idea that the bank's fraud division operated at all hours, with an automated alert system that flagged large disputed transactions and routed them to a live agent when the account involved exceeded a certain threshold. He had no idea that Claire Bennett, the woman he had written off as too proud and too controlled to fight back, had spent the last 45 minutes quietly and methodically ensuring that the world he had built on her money was about to receive a very specific phone call. He had made the mistake that people sometimes make about quiet people. He had confused her silence for absence. She was still in the building, and she was just getting started. The business center closed at midnight. A young man in a hotel uniform, 19, maybe 20, with the particular tired, polite expression of someone working the late shift, knocked on the glass door at 11:58 and told Claire he needed to lock up. She thanked him, saved the document she'd been building for the last hour, emailed it to herself and to Rachel, and gathered her things. She stood in the corridor for a moment and listened. The string quartet had stopped a while ago. She could hear from somewhere above the muffled bass line of a DJ now. The reception had moved into its next phase, which meant the ceremony was done, and Nathan Cole was, in the eyes of whatever officiant he'd hired, a married man for the second time. Claire thought about that for exactly as long as she allowed herself to think about it, which was maybe 4 seconds, and then she pushed the thought flat and walked toward the elevator. She was not going home. Not yet. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the Aldwyn kept a small guest lounge available to anyone who wanted a quiet room, a coffee machine, and access to the secure business Wi-Fi. She had used it twice before during early morning conference calls when she needed silence. The lounge was empty now, except for a man in his 60s asleep in an armchair with a paperback open on his chest, and she settled into a chair near the window and opened her laptop. Rachel had already sent a response to her email. It was short. Got the screenshots. Forwarding to my financial crimes contact tonight. Do not confront Nathan until we've assessed exposure. Call me at 7 a.m. Claire wrote back, "Understood. I'll be ready." She set a phone alarm for 6:30, closed her eyes for a moment, and thought about what she actually knew versus what she was still guessing at. What she knew: Nathan had accessed her business account using the secondary card she'd given him 3 years ago. He had made a series of large purchases over what appeared to be, based on the transaction dates she'd screenshotted, the last 11 days. The total came to $94,312. The purchases were not random. They formed a pattern, a deliberate and organized pattern, the kind that required planning and coordination. Flowers, venue deposits, catering, jewelry, lighting, invitation printing, a hotel suite. Everything needed for a wedding of roughly the scale she'd witnessed downstairs. What she was guessing at: how long this had been happening, how long Nathan had been involved with Vivian Hart, whether there were other accounts, other access points, other money she hadn't found yet. That last question was the one that kept her awake. She had always been the one who earned more. It had never been a point of tension between them. Or rather, it had been a point of tension that they had learned to paper over well enough that she'd stopped noticing the paper. Nathan's career had its peaks and its long, flat stretches. He was a good attorney in the way that a lot of attorneys are good, competent, careful, occasionally excellent. But he had never developed the appetite for the kind of grind that built a practice from scratch. And over the years, he had moved from firm to firm in a pattern that she'd understood as bad luck and adaptability, and had only now, sitting in a hotel lounge at midnight, begun to re-examine. She thought about the 3-year gap, 6 or 7 years into their marriage, when he'd been between positions, and she'd taken on the majority of their shared expenses without discussion. She'd told herself it was temporary. She'd told herself this was what marriage was: you covered each other. She thought about the renovation of their apartment 3 years ago, which she had funded almost entirely while Nathan was in what he described as a delayed billing cycle with a major client. She thought about the car he drove and the suits he wore and the last vacation they'd taken 14 months ago to Portugal, which she had booked and paid for while he'd said he'd reimburse her when his year-end bonus cleared. The bonus had been smaller than expected, he'd told her. She had said it was fine. She pulled up her personal account, the one Nathan did not have access to, and then slowly she began pulling up every joint account, every shared expense account, every card or financial instrument that carried both their names or that he had any access to at all. She worked methodically, the way she worked through any complex financial picture, moving from account to account and building a timeline. She had always been better at this than almost anyone she knew. Not because she was a genius, but because she was patient, and because she genuinely did not find numbers threatening. Numbers were honest. Numbers showed you exactly what had happened, whether you wanted to know or not. By 1:15 in the morning, she had a rough picture. It was worse than she'd thought. The $94,000 on the business account was the largest single incident, but it was not the only incident. Over the past 2 years, there were patterns of withdrawal and transfer from shared accounts that she had not examined carefully enough at the time. Amounts that were individually explainable, collectively damning. A $12,000 transfer she had accepted Nathan's explanation for. A series of ATM withdrawals in the $800 to $1,200 range, frequent enough to add up but spaced out enough to avoid tripping any automatic flags. A shared household credit card she barely used, on which there were charges from restaurants and hotels she didn't recognize, from cities she hadn't visited with him. She added it up twice to make sure. In addition to the $94,000, there was somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 more that had moved through shared financial channels in ways that, in the light of tonight, no longer had innocent explanations. She sat with that number. Then she opened a new document and started organizing it into columns. At 2 a.m., a hotel staff member, a different one, a woman this time, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, came into the lounge to refill the coffee station and found Claire still at her laptop. "You doing okay, honey?" the woman asked. She had the direct, non-performing kindness of someone who'd worked hospitality for decades and had long since learned the difference between guests who wanted to be left alone and guests who were in some kind of trouble. "I'm fine," Claire said. Then, "Do you have decaf?" "In the blue pot." The woman set it on the warmer. "Long night?" "Longer than expected." The woman glanced at the laptop screen, not reading it, just registering that it existed, and then looked back at Claire. "You sure you're okay?" Claire looked up from the screen. She almost said yes again, automatically, the way she said it to everyone, but something about the woman's face, The fact that it was 2 in the morning and they were the only two people in this room and the question was entirely genuine made her pause. My husband is upstairs, Claire said, getting married to someone else. The woman with the reading glasses was quiet for a moment. While he's still married to you? She said finally. While he's still married to me. Another pause. The woman picked up the empty coffee carafe and held it against her chest. You need me to call anyone? No. Claire almost smiled. I have people. Okay. The woman moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of things happen in hotels in 40 years. The people who sit quietly and do the work, they always come out the other end. She left. Claire looked back at her screen. She poured a cup of decaf she didn't really want and drank half of it and kept working. Rachel Monroe arrived at the Aldwyn at 7:12 a.m. Claire had not slept. She had gone back to the fourth-floor lounge after a brief attempt to find a position on one of the lobby sofas that would allow her to rest, which had failed, and she had spent the remaining hours alternating between organizing her financial documentation and watching the city come alive outside the window. Manhattan, at 4 in the morning, was a specific kind of quiet. Not silent, never actually silent, but lower, slower, like the city was breathing between efforts. Rachel came through the lobby doors in her work coat with a coffee tray and a leather messenger bag and the expression of someone who had been briefed and was ready to be useful. You look terrible, Rachel said, setting the coffee on the table between them. Thank you, Claire said. I mean it as a clinical observation. Did you sleep? No? That's a problem we'll deal with later. Rachel sat down and pulled a folder from her bag. Okay, here's where we are. I spoke to my contact at the Financial Crimes Unit last night. Given the amount and the nature of the transactions, a secondary account holder making large unauthorized purchases for personal use without the primary holder's knowledge or consent. We are comfortably in the territory of financial fraud. The question is whether you want to pursue it criminally, civilly, or both. Both, Claire said. Rachel looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. I expected you to need more time to decide that. I had all night. Fair enough. Rachel opened the folder. I also pulled the marriage records. You and Nathan are legally married. No separation agreement, no divorce filing, no legal proceedings of any kind on record. Whatever happened upstairs last night was not legal. Because he's still married to me. Correct. Which means Vivian Hart is not his wife in any legally recognized sense, and Nathan has, in addition to everything else, potentially exposed himself to criminal liability on a bigamy statute, though that's typically prosecuted at the state level and the bar is higher than people expect. Claire listened to all of this carefully. Rachel talked the way good lawyers talked, precisely, without unnecessary padding, cutting straight to the operative facts. What about the account? Claire asked. I called Daniel Pierce at 6 this morning. He confirmed the account is flagged and that a fraud review was opened last night based on your call. Any pending transactions that haven't fully settled, if any vendors still have open authorizations, may be affected. What does that mean practically? It means, Rachel said, that some of the people Nathan hired for that wedding may wake up this morning to find their payments haven't cleared. Claire thought about the florist, the catering company, the lighting vendor. She thought about the venue deposit, the Aldwyn itself. Does the hotel know? She asked. Not yet. That would happen through their own finance department when they run their end-of-event billing. If any outstanding charges are flagged by the bank review, they'll hear about it. How soon? Could be this morning, could be by noon. Rachel folded her hands on the folder. Claire, there's something else I want to ask you, and I want you to answer honestly and not the way you answer things in professional settings. Claire waited. How are you doing? Actually. The question sat in the air between them. Claire looked at her coffee. She thought about the woman with the reading glasses and the 40 years of hotel work. She thought about the bench near the elevator and the patterned carpet and the feeling of her hands going still. I'm angry, she said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. Not the kind of angry that wants to scream at someone. The other kind. The cold kind, Rachel said. Yeah. Good, Rachel said without any particular gentleness. That's the kind that's useful. They spent 2 hours at the table in the lounge going through the financial documentation Claire had assembled overnight. Rachel was a meticulous person, and she moved through the columns and timelines with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between a case that held and a case that fell apart was almost always in the details. She asked questions. She flagged inconsistencies. She made notes in the margins of her printed copies with a pen. She clicked open and closed unconsciously as she worked. At one point, she looked up and said, "This transfer here, April of last year, you said he explained it as a client expense reimbursement?" He said a client had fronted costs on a matter and Nathan needed to cover it temporarily. And you didn't ask for documentation. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a fact. I didn't ask for documentation, Claire confirmed. Okay. Rachel made a note. That's a gap. We can work around it, but I want you to know it's there. There are probably more gaps, Claire said. I trusted him. You trusted him, Rachel repeated, and she said it without inflection, without pity, just acknowledging it as a fact in the record, and Claire appreciated that more than she could have explained. They were still working when Claire's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. Ms. Bennett, this is Marcus Webb from the Aldwin's Events Finance Department. I understand you may have some connection to last night's Cole Hart event. We're having some issues with account settlements from last evening, and I wonder if you might be available for a brief call. She showed the screen to Rachel. Rachel read it. The venue, she said. The venue, Claire confirmed. They looked at each other. Don't call him yet, Rachel said. Let me make 2 calls first. Rachel stepped away from the table. Claire could see her near the window, her back turned, speaking in the low, controlled voice she used when she was being precise about something important. Claire sat and looked out at the street. The morning was fully arrived now. Cabs and delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog, a man in construction clothes eating from a paper bag on a stoop. The ordinary texture of the city, unchanged and indifferent, moving through its rhythms the same as every other day. Upstairs, on whatever floor the bridal suite was on, Nathan Cole was probably still asleep. He had married Vivian Hart last night in a grand ballroom paid for with his wife's money, and he had gone to bed believing the hardest part was over. Claire thought about the look on his face in the corridor, the calculation behind his eyes, the way he had assessed the situation and concluded she was an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. The assumption that ran underneath his behavior like a current, that she would absorb this, like she had absorbed everything else, and eventually go away. She had absorbed a great deal, over 14 years. She had covered deficits and stayed quiet and smiled at his colleagues' parties, and given his career the kind of steady behind-the-scenes support that never got credited because it was too consistent to notice. She had been the infrastructure, the thing that held everything up while appearing to do nothing at all. He had built his entire life on that infrastructure, and then attempted to demolish her with it. Rachel came back to the table. Okay, she said. I spoke to Daniel Pierce and I spoke to my financial crimes contact. Here's what's happening. The bank's review triggered an automatic hold on several pending vendor payments connected to last night's event. The final catering balance, the DJ, the floral breakdown service, and the hotel's own outstanding room and event charges. Those vendors either woke up this morning to bounced authorizations or will within the next few hours. Nathan will know something's wrong. He'll know something's wrong, Rachel agreed. He'll try to reach the bank. He's a secondary user and the primary account is flagged. He won't get far. He has his own accounts. He does. But here's the thing. Rachel sat down. Some of those vendors may have additional charges still pending on Claire Bennett's account as the contact name on the booking. The hotel especially. You need to be ready for contact from them. Marcus Webb already texted me. Right. So, Rachel looked at her steadily. How do you want to handle Nathan when he realizes what's happening? Claire thought about it. He doesn't know I'm still in this building, she said. No, he thinks you left. He thinks I left because I was too proud to make a scene, she paused. He doesn't know about the account review. Not yet. He will soon. Someone is going to tell him a payment failed, or he's going to try to access the account himself. She looked at Rachel. When that happens, what's his most likely move? Rachel considered. He'll try to reach you. He'll want to control the narrative, either explain it away or make you feel responsible for disrupting the situation. He'll call, Claire said. He'll call. So I answer. She said it simply, like it was obvious. And I let him talk. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. You know, she said, most clients in your situation want to do something. Make a move. Show their hand. Showing your hand early is how you lose the leverage, Claire said. I know that. I've been doing this for 25 years. So do we agree? Rachel picked up her pen, clicked it once. We agree. The call came at 9:47 a.m. Claire saw Nathan's name on the screen and let it ring twice before answering. Claire. His voice was alert. Not panicked. Nathan didn't panic easily, but alert in the way he got when something was not going according to plan. There's been some issue with a financial account. Good morning, Claire said. A pause. She could hear faintly movement on his end. A door closing. I need you to release the hold on the account, he said. What hold? Don't. His voice dropped, went tight. The bank flagged the account. There's a review. I need you to call and release it. I'm not sure I know what you're referring to, Nathan. Claire. A long beat. She could hear him working to keep his voice level. Whatever you think you're doing right now, this is not the time. Last night was a wedding reception, she offered. Silence. I would like to understand, Claire said, and she kept her voice perfectly even, the voice she used in the hardest negotiations, the voice that gave away nothing, why there are $94,000 in charges on my business account for what appears to be an event I was not invited to. Another silence. Longer. That can be explained, Nathan said. I'd love to hear it. Not like this, not over the phone. That's interesting, Claire said, because 2 hours ago you were perfectly comfortable having this conversation through the hotel corridor. He exhaled sharply. I understand you're upset. I'm really not, Claire said. And the strange thing, the thing that surprised even her slightly, was that it was true. She wasn't upset, not in the way he meant it. She was not crying or shaking or breaking things. She was sitting in a hotel lounge with a cold cup of decaf and a folder full of transaction records, and the particular focus that comes when you have finally decided to stop carrying something you've been carrying too long. What I am, Nathan, is finished. He said nothing. I want you to know, she continued, that I've spoken to my attorney and to my bank. I have documentation of every transaction. The account review is going to proceed regardless of any action I take today. And I want you to think very carefully about the next thing you say to me. A long pause. Then, you're making a mistake. Okay, Claire said. Claire, I'll have Rachel contact your attorney. Have a good morning. She ended the call. Rachel, who had been sitting across from her listening to Claire's half of the conversation, looked at her without expression for a moment and then said, You're either the calmest person I've ever worked with, or you're going to fall apart in about 3 days. Probably the second one, Claire said honestly, but not today. Fair enough. Rachel closed her folder. Okay, there's something we need to discuss. Tell me. The account review is going to move forward. The fraud case is building itself at this point. Your documentation is solid and the transaction pattern is clear, but I want you to think about what kind of resolution you actually want here. She leaned forward slightly, because you can pursue this as aggressively as the law allows, or you can use it as leverage to negotiate a fast and favorable divorce settlement. Both are valid. They require different strategies. Claire looked out the window. He spent 14 years letting me believe I had a partner, she said. He spent my money on a wedding to another woman and told me I wasn't invited. She turned back to Rachel. I want both. Rachel almost smiled. That's going to be complicated. That's fine, Claire said. I'm good at complicated. At 10:30, Marcus Webb from the Aldwin's Events Finance Department called, and Claire answered and was patient and professional with him, explaining that she was in the process of disputing unauthorized charges made to her account and that her attorney would be in contact with the hotel's legal department directly. Marcus Webb sounded relieved to have a clear point of contact, which told her the hotel was having a worse morning than she'd expected regarding the event billing. She spent the next 2 hours on calls. Rachel's office, Daniel Pierce, a forensic accountant Rachel had referred her to named Gretchen Howell, who specialized in marital financial fraud and who asked questions in a focused, clipped manner that Claire appreciated. Gretchen wanted every document, every statement, every account number. She wanted timelines. She wanted to know about every job Nathan had held, every period of income reduction, every shared account that had existed at any point in the marriage. This is going to take a few weeks to fully reconstruct, Gretchen told her. However long it takes, Claire said, I'm going to need access to your shared filing history, tax returns, jointly filed returns going back as far as the marriage. I have them. I'd expect the picture to be larger than what you found last night, Gretchen said. It wasn't cruel, just direct, the way a doctor is direct when they're telling you the extent of something. Usually when we find a pattern this deliberate, the behavior predates the obvious incident by several years. How much larger? I won't guess, but you should be prepared. Claire said she understood. She hung up and sat quietly for a moment. She thought about Portugal. about the renovation, about the client reimbursement that was never documented, about 14 years of small moments that had seemed unremarkable in isolation. She opened her laptop and added a new section to her document. She titled it, Questions I Should Have Asked Sooner. Then she deleted the title and replaced it with, What I Know Now. The distinction mattered to her. Looking back served a purpose. You needed the information. But framing it as things she should have caught, should have questioned, should have seen, was a trap. She had trusted someone. That had been her choice, and it had been a reasonable one given what she knew, and the fact that the trust had been exploited did not make the trust the error. The exploitation was the error, and it belonged entirely to Nathan. She typed that into the document as a reminder she could return to on the days, and she knew there would be days, when she would be tempted to make herself the villain of her own story. Outside the window, the city kept moving. Cabs, delivery trucks. People who had no idea that any of this was happening and didn't need to. On some floor of this building, Nathan Cole was dealing with a day that was not going the way he'd planned. Claire closed her laptop, finished the cold decaf, and went to find the elevator. She had work to do. Load later messages. She found a room. Not in the Aldwyn. She wasn't going to stay in the same building as Nathan's reception suite. Not another night. But in a smaller hotel 3 blocks east, a place she'd walked past 100 times without ever going inside. It was clean and quiet and cost a third of what the Aldwyn charged, and the woman at the front desk did not make conversation, which was exactly what Claire needed. She showered for the first time in over 24 hours, changed into the spare set of clothes she kept in her carry-on for delayed flights, and sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop and her phone and the folder Rachel had left with her. She had not eaten since the airport in Chicago. She ordered room service, eggs she didn't particularly want, toast she ate mechanically, and kept working while she ate, scrolling through statements, cross-referencing dates, adding to the document she'd been building since 1 in the morning. The work was absorbing in the specific way that detail-heavy tasks are absorbing when you are trying not to feel something. The focus required left very little room for anything else. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Diane. Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you since yesterday morning. Claire stared at the message for a moment. Diane was 3 years younger and lived in Philadelphia, and they talked maybe twice a month. Not because they were distant, but because their lives ran on different tracks, and the space between calls had always felt comfortable rather than neglected. Claire had not told anyone in her family about what had happened. She had not told anyone except Rachel and the professionals Rachel had put her in touch with. She wrote back, I'm okay, busy week, call you soon. It was technically true and completely insufficient, and she knew it and sent it anyway. She wasn't ready yet. Ready was the wrong word. She wasn't in the right place yet. There was no version of that conversation that didn't require her to say things out loud. She hadn't fully processed in her own head, and she had learned long ago that speaking something before you understood it fully was a good way to say the wrong thing and have to walk it back later. She set the phone down and went back to the spreadsheet. Rachel called at 2 in the afternoon. How are you holding up? Rachel asked. Working, Claire said. Gretchen Howell sent me a preliminary intake list. I'm pulling the documents she needs. Good. I want to update you on a few things. Rachel's voice had the particular tone it got when she was moving between items on a mental list. First, Nathan's attorney reached out this morning. Claire's hand paused over the keyboard. He already has an attorney. Apparently he's been in contact with someone for at least a few weeks. A man named Gerald Fitch. Do you know him? The name is familiar. Corporate defense, mostly. Some domestic work. She thought about it. Expensive. Very expensive, Rachel confirmed, which is interesting given the state of Nathan's disclosed income over the last 2 years. Gerald's opening position, communicated through a fairly clipped email, is that Nathan would like to resolve the financial matter quietly and quickly without public proceedings. Of course he would. He's framing the account access as a marital misunderstanding, a miscommunication about shared finances. Claire laughed once, a short, flat sound that wasn't particularly amused. $94,000 of miscommunication. His word was informality. He said Nathan accessed the account informally for what he believed were joint marital expenses. A pause. I want you to be prepared for the fact that this will be Nathan's position going forward, that the two of you had an informal arrangement that he was operating within. We had an informal arrangement for household expenses. The wedding of his girlfriend is not a household expense. I know that. You know that. Making a judge know that is what we're going to spend the next several months doing. Rachel's voice stayed level. The other thing I want to flag, Vivian Hart. The name landed differently in daylight than it had in the corridor of the hotel the night before. Claire wasn't sure why. Maybe because in the corridor it had been abstract, a woman in an expensive dress, a presence at an altar. And now she was a person with a name that Rachel was saying in an attorney's professional tone, which made her real in a different way. What about her? Claire asked. She checked out of the bridal suite this morning, alone. Claire absorbed this. Nathan. Still in the hotel as far as we know. Different room. The suite was booked under both names and the reservation was flagged this morning, when the hotel's finance team couldn't reconcile the charges. It sounds like the conversation between them was not quiet. How do you know that? Marcus Webb, Rachel said. He called me this morning after I sent the hotel's legal contact the preliminary dispute documentation. He was very forthcoming. He said hotel staff were aware of a significant disturbance on the 8th floor around 7 a.m. Claire thought about Vivian Hart, the dark hair, the ivory dress, the easy way she had rested her hand on Nathan's arm. She tried to feel something about her and mostly came up with blankness, which was probably appropriate. Vivian was not her problem. Vivian had, as far as Claire could tell, been deceived by the same person who had deceived her, and whatever Vivian was dealing with this morning in a hotel room on the 8th floor was a consequence of Nathan's choices, not Claire's. She's not my concern, Claire said. I agree. I'm telling you because it's relevant to Nathan's current state. He has just watched his new marriage fall apart in under 12 hours. He's been on the phone with Gerald Fitch all morning. He's operating from a defensive position. Good. Defensive people make mistakes, Rachel said. I want to be ready for them. Well, she got back to the apartment at 4 that afternoon. It was the first time she'd been there since leaving for the airport 4 days ago. And the familiar smell of it, the particular mixture of the good coffee she bought, and whatever wood polish the cleaning service used, hit her strangely. The apartment was tidy. She hadn't expected otherwise. The cleaning service came on Wednesdays. Everything was in its place. The plants on the windowsill had been watered. The kitchen counter was clear. It looked like a home. She stood in the entry hall with her carry-on and looked at it, and then she walked through it slowly, the way you walk through a space when you're trying to see it clearly for the first time. The apartment was hers. She had found it, she had negotiated the purchase, she had managed the renovation and dealt with the contractor who kept changing timelines and argued with the building management over the HVAC installation. She had carried the mortgage since its inception because Nathan's income had been insufficient at the time to meet the bank's primary borrower requirements. His name was on the deed. She had added it later, during a period when they were talking about estate planning in a vague, optimistic way, but the financial reality of the place was entirely hers. She went to Nathan's home office. It was a small room off the hallway, bookshelves, a desk, a filing cabinet he kept locked. She did not have the key to the filing cabinet because she had never needed it. She had never thought to want it. She stood in front of the cabinet for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and found the small toolkit she kept in the drawer next to the refrigerator, and she used a flathead screwdriver and a patience she had not known she possessed until tonight to work the lock on the filing cabinet for 11 minutes until it gave. Inside there were 4 drawers. She started at the top. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly. Evidence was too dramatic a word for it. She was looking for the shape of things. The shape of Nathan's actual financial life as it existed outside the picture he had presented to her. The first drawer was mostly client files from his practice, which she set aside. The second drawer had personal documents, birth certificate, passport, an envelope containing what turned out to be a series of cash receipts from various transactions she couldn't immediately contextualize. The third drawer. She pulled it open and saw a folder labeled simply with a date, 18 months ago. Inside the folder was a lease agreement, an apartment lease, a 1-bedroom unit on the Upper East Side signed by Nathan Cole as tenant. The monthly rent was $4,200. The lease start date was 18 months ago, and the term was 2 years. Claire sat down on the floor. Not because her legs gave out, they didn't, but because the room was small and she wanted to be closer to the ground, and there was no chair and the floor was available. She read the lease again. Then she read the stack of documents underneath it. Utility bills in Nathan's name, sent to the Upper East Side address. A credit card statement, a card she had no knowledge of, with charges that painted a very clear picture of a second domestic life. Grocery deliveries, restaurant receipts in the neighborhood of the apartment, a gym membership, a streaming service subscription. She found a printed email thread near the bottom of the folder. The emails were between Nathan and someone identified only as V. She did not need to work hard to understand who V was. And they went back 2 years and 3 months. 2 years and 3 months. Not a recent affair. Not something that had caught fire and gotten out of hand. 2 years and 3 months of deliberate, maintained, carefully managed parallel life. She read enough of the emails to understand the shape of the relationship, and then stopped reading them, not because they were unbearable, but because she did not need the detail, and the detail was not hers. She sat on the floor of Nathan's home office with the folder in her lap and breathed slowly. 2 years and 3 months. She thought about 2 years ago. She had been in the middle of a major corporate restructuring at her company, working 70-hour weeks, traveling frequently. What had Nathan been doing 2 years ago? He had been at a firm he would leave 8 months later, saying the partnership track wasn't what he'd hoped, saying the culture was wrong, saying he needed a change. He had been maintaining an apartment on the Upper East Side for the woman he would eventually hold a wedding for in a hotel ballroom paid for with her money. She put the folder carefully to one side. She got up off the floor, went to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. She drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the street below. Then she went back to Nathan's office, took photographs of every document in the filing cabinet, sent them to Rachel and to Gretchen Howell, and wrote a single line beneath the images in her email. Found more. Call me when you can. So Rachel called within 15 minutes. The apartment, Claire said before Rachel could ask. I see it. Rachel's voice was controlled, but Claire could hear the sharpened attention behind it. How long? Lease started 18 months ago. The emails go back 2 years and 3 months. A pause. Okay, Rachel said, and she said it in the way that meant she was recalibrating the entire picture. This changes the financial exposure significantly. If he was maintaining a second residence for nearly 2 years, we need to know how that was being funded. If any of it traces back to shared accounts or marital assets, find out, Claire said. I'm calling Gretchen right now. A brief silence. Claire, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as your attorney, and not as someone trying to manage your emotions, because I'm not trying to manage your emotions. Go ahead. What you found in that cabinet is going to be very powerful in a legal proceeding. It establishes a pattern, a timeline, and intent. This is not a man who made a bad decision. This is a man who built a second life in a deliberate and sustained way over a significant period. The difference matters enormously in how a court looks at the division of assets and the financial misconduct claim. I understand. What I want you to also understand, Rachel continued, is that the next time you see Nathan, and you will have to see him at some point, probably soon, he is going to try to reframe this. He will try to make it smaller than it is. He will try to make you feel like you are overreacting to something that has an innocent explanation. He has done that your entire marriage, from the sound of it, and he's very good at it. Claire was quiet for a moment. He is good at it, she said. So I want you to be ready. Not emotionally ready. You don't have to be. Procedurally ready. You let Rachel Monroe do the talking. You let the documents do the talking. You do not give him the opportunity to find the version of you that is still 17% unsure of herself, because that's what he's going to look for. Claire almost smiled. 17%. Everyone's got a percentage, Rachel said. Knowing yours is how you protect it. Nathan came to the apartment at 6 p.m. She had known he would come. He had texted twice that afternoon. One message asking if they could talk. One message that started with, I know you're angry, and which she had not finished reading. She had not responded to either. She had, however, texted the building doorman to let her know when Nathan arrived, which was how she was ready, seated at the kitchen table with her phone face down and a glass of water in front of her, when she heard his key in the lock. He came in the way he always came in when he was managing something. Deliberate steps, measured pace, the posture of a man who had rehearsed the room. He stopped when he saw her sitting there. I didn't know you were home, he said. I live here, Claire said. He set his keys on the entry table, his usual spot, and came to stand at the edge of the kitchen. He had changed since the wedding. He was in a dark sweater and slacks, the formal clothes gone. He looked tired. He also, she noticed, looked like a man who had already had several difficult conversations today and was calculating how to have one more. Claire, he pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down. We need to talk about this rationally. I'm being very rational, she said. I know you found the account charges. I found more than the account charges, Nathan. His eyes shifted slightly. Not much, but she had 14 years of reading his face, and she caught it. I found the lease, she said, the Upper East Side apartment, The credit card statements, the emails. A silence. It was not the silence of a man who was devastated or ashamed. It was the silence of a man revising his approach. That's not what it looks like, he said. You've been maintaining a separate apartment for 18 months, Claire said. You've been involved with Vivian Hart for over 2 years. You spent $94,000 from my account to fund a wedding ceremony to a woman you legally cannot marry because you are still married to me. She said it all evenly, without emphasis, the way you state terms in a negotiation. That is what it looks like, Nathan. The documents agree with what it looks like. He leaned forward, put his elbows on the table. She recognized this posture. It was his listening posture, the one that signaled he was about to appear reasonable and collaborative. I was going to tell you, he said. I had planned to, before any of this. When? She asked. Soon. It wasn't the way this happened. This wasn't what I wanted. What did you want? I wanted to handle this like adults. I wanted to come to you and have a real conversation about where we were. Where we were, Claire repeated. Our marriage hasn't been what either of us needed for a long time. You know that. She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them with the particular steadiness he'd always had. The courtroom steadiness, the deposition steadiness, the look that made juries and opposing counsel believe they were in the presence of a reasonable man. Here's what I know, Claire said. I know that for 14 years I supported this marriage financially through every gap and difficulty without complaint and without making you feel small about it. I know that I trusted you with access to my accounts because I believed we were partners. I know that you used that access to fund a life you were building without my knowledge. And I know that when I walked into that hotel last night, you didn't apologize, you didn't explain, you told me I wasn't invited and walked back into the room. He looked down at the table briefly. When he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted. The reasonable, collaborative posture had adjusted itself slightly, the way a sail adjusts to a change in wind. I handled last night badly, he said. I know that. I'm not asking for an apology, Claire said. I don't want one. What I want is for you to understand that this conversation is not negotiation. My attorney will be in contact with yours. The financial review is proceeding. The documentation exists. His jaw tightened. Gerald says the account access is defensible given the nature of our financial arrangement. Gerald is welcome to make that argument in front of a judge, Claire said. I'll have my own documentation ready. A long pause. Nathan looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face in a long time. She wasn't sure she could name it exactly. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't even quite anger. It was something closer to recalibration. The look of a man who had built his assessment of a situation on a set of assumptions and was only now beginning to understand how badly the assumptions had failed him. I didn't think you'd fight, he said. It came out quieter than anything else he'd said, almost honest. I know, Claire said. That's not what Nathan. She stood up from the table. You should find somewhere else to stay tonight. Your attorney can arrange a time for you to collect your things. He looked up at her. This is my apartment, she said, and she said it without heat, just as a fact that existed in the record. I bought it, I carry the mortgage, and I'd like you out of it. Your attorney and mine can discuss the details. He stayed seated for another moment, as if movement were something he needed to decide on rather than just do. Then he stood, slowly, and picked up his keys from the entry table. At the door he stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't plan for it to happen this way. I believe you, Claire said. I don't think it matters. He left. She stood in her kitchen and listened to the elevator arrive and depart. Then she sat back down at the table and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just resting her forehead against her palms for a minute, letting the weight of the day settle into her. Her phone buzzed. Rachel. Gretchen has begun the full financial reconstruction. She thinks it's going to be bigger than we initially thought. Also, Gerald Fitch sent another email. Nathan is requesting a mediated settlement conversation before formal proceedings. Claire lifted her head and picked up the phone. She typed, We can agree to mediation, on our timeline and our terms. I'll call you in the morning. She set the phone down. Outside the window, the city was moving into evening. The particular hour when the light went flat and orange and the traffic noise shifted in frequency, lower and more sustained. She had lived in this city for 16 years. She had built her career here from the ground floor up, in the specific way that people build careers when they have no one to call in a favor, when every advancement is the result of outworking the room. She knew this city the way you know a place that has required something from you and received it. She was still here. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept. which was more than she'd managed the night before. In the morning, she made coffee in her own kitchen and drank it at the window and felt the particular quiet of the apartment without another person in it, which was different from silence. More specific, more personal, a quiet that had her shape in it. She had a 7:30 call with Gretchen Howell, who had been working through the night. "I want to give you a number," Gretchen said, without preamble. "It's a preliminary number, and it will likely grow as I get deeper into the filing history, but I want you to have a working picture." "Go ahead," Claire said. "Over the course of your marriage, I can currently trace approximately $240,000 in marital assets that were redirected, misappropriated, or used without the primary earner's knowledge or consent for Nathan Cole's personal benefit or for the maintenance of a secondary relationship." A pause. "That includes the $94,000 from last week. It does not yet include the value of financial opportunities you may have foregone in support of his career, which is a separate category of analysis." Claire was quiet for a moment. $240,000, she said. "Preliminary," Gretchen said. "I want to be clear about that, but I want you to know the scale we're working with." Claire set her coffee cup down on the windowsill and looked out at the street below. A woman was walking a small dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The ordinary Thursday morning machinery of the city running without awareness of any particular person's particular catastrophe. "Okay," she said. "Are you all right?" Gretchen asked. She said it the way professionals who deal with difficult situations ask it, plainly, without excessive softness, giving the question room to be answered honestly. "I'm functioning," Claire said, "which is what matters right now." "Fair enough," Gretchen said. "I'll have a full preliminary report to Rachel by end of week." After the call, Claire sat for a few minutes and did nothing. $240,000. She had spent 14 years believing she was building something with another person. She had looked at their shared life and seen collaboration, imperfect, unequal in some ways, but genuinely mutual. She had told herself that the inequality in contribution was circumstantial, temporary, the kind of imbalance that most partnerships navigated at some point. What she had actually been doing was funding a performance. Nathan had performed the marriage, attended the dinners, kept the apartment, been present in the way that a person can be present without actually being invested. He had taken what the marriage offered and directed a significant portion of it toward a life he was building somewhere else, with someone else, on Claire's time and Claire's money and Claire's willingness to not ask questions she should have asked. She picked up her coffee cup. She was not going to spend today in that particular loop. The loop was understandable, and she would probably return to it many times over the coming months, sitting with the versions of events she hadn't recognized, the signs she could have read if she'd been looking. But today there was work to do, and she was the person who did the work. 11 emails from the previous 24 hours. 2 from Rachel's office, 3 from Gretchen's intake team, 1 from Marcus Webb at the Aldwyn confirming the hotel's legal team had formally accepted the dispute documentation, 1 from her colleague at work asking about her return schedule, and 4 from addresses she didn't recognize. She opened the 4 unknown ones carefully. 3 of them were from journalists. She stared at the screen. The subject lines were variations on the same thing. Following up on the Cole Hart event at the Aldwyn and comment request, wedding reception payment dispute, and are you available to speak about Thursday evening? She forwarded all 3 to Rachel with a single line. How did the press get this? Rachel's response came in 4 minutes. Hotels talk, staff talk. Someone on the events team probably. This is going to move fast. Do not respond to any media contact. I'm handling it. Claire closed her laptop. She thought about Nathan, somewhere in the city this morning, waking up to the same emails she had just seen. Nathan, who had spent 20 years building a professional reputation as a careful and deliberate attorney. Nathan, whose name was now attached to a story that had all the elements the internet found most irresistible: betrayal, money, a wedding, a wife who showed up. She thought about the corridor of the Aldwyn. "You're not invited," said without flinching, said in the voice he used for depositions, said to a woman he had been systematically deceiving and financially exploiting for years. She had not planned for the press. She had not wanted the press. That was not what this was about. But she found, sitting in her kitchen on a Thursday morning with cold coffee and 4 journalists in her inbox, that she was not particularly sorry about it. Some things had a weight to them that could only be carried by the truth being visible. Nathan had counted on her invisibility. He had made his calculations based on a version of her that would absorb the blow quietly and manage the wreckage privately and eventually, gracefully, disappear from the situation. He had miscounted every variable. She poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh cup and called Rachel back, and they began, in the particular methodical way that both of them understood was the only way to approach something with this many moving parts, to figure out exactly what came next. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday, 11 days after the wedding that wasn't. Rachel had negotiated the terms carefully. Neutral location, both attorneys present, no press, no recording devices, a strict time limit of 3 hours. Gerald Fitch had pushed for a longer session, which Rachel had declined, and the refusal had been deliberate. 3 hours was enough to establish position. It was not enough for Nathan to run the kind of long-game conversational strategy he was good at, the slow, methodical repositioning that wore people down over time. Claire spent the weekend before the mediation not preparing speeches or rehearsing arguments, but doing something she found more useful. She went back through everything, start to finish, and built a single clean document that told the complete financial story of her marriage in chronological order. Not a legal document, not yet. That was Gretchen's territory. Just a document for herself. A record that began with their first joint account, opened 3 months after the wedding in Vermont, and ended with the transaction log from the night she had sat in the Aldwin's Business Center reading $94,000 of charges by hotel event lighting. She read it once when it was finished. Then she saved it, closed it, and did not open it again. She had learned something over years of difficult professional negotiations. You prepared until you knew the material, and then you stopped preparing, because over-preparation created a kind of rigidity that worked against you in rooms where the situation was going to move in ways you couldn't fully anticipate. You needed to know the ground, but you also needed to be able to move on it. Her sister Diane called on Sunday evening. Claire answered this time. She had been sitting on the couch with a book she hadn't been reading, and she let the phone ring twice, and then picked it up because avoiding it felt like a form of lying, and she was done with things being hidden. "Hey, Diane, I've been worried about you." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize." A pause. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or am I going to read about it somewhere?" Claire exhaled slowly. "What have you heard?" "Nothing specific, just, you've been off the grid, which you don't do. And there's something with Nathan. I saw a headline, but I didn't read it because I didn't want to know it from a headline." "Smart," Claire said. Then she said, "Nathan was getting married, last Thursday, at a hotel 2 blocks from our apartment." Silence. "While married to you," Diane said finally. "While married to me." Another silence. Longer. Claire could hear her sister breathing, could almost feel the quality of the silence. The particular texture of someone trying to process something that doesn't fit any existing category of experience. "Claire," Diane said, "I know." "How are you?" "I'm okay," Claire said, and then stopped herself because that was the automatic response, and Diane deserved better than the automatic response. "I'm not okay, but I'm functioning. I'm building the case. I have a good attorney. I want to come to New York." "You don't need to." "I want to," Diane said firmly, the way she said things when she meant them and didn't want to be talked out of them. "I'm not coming to help. I just want to be in the same city as you for a few days." Claire was quiet for a moment. She was not a person who accepted help easily. She had learned self-sufficiency the way people learn it when it's required of them, when there isn't another option, and the habit of handling things alone had embedded itself so thoroughly into her way of moving through the world that she often didn't notice it until someone offered her something and she felt the reflexive urge to decline. She noticed it now. "Okay," she said. "Come Thursday. I'll be done with the mediation by afternoon." "I'll be there," Diane said. After they hung up, Claire sat with the quiet of the apartment and thought that it was strange how a single conversation could shift the weight of something. The situation had not changed. The documents existed, the financial exposure existed, the mediation was scheduled, and Nathan was wherever Nathan was, doing whatever recalculations Nathan did. Nothing had changed. But the apartment felt slightly less like a place she was enduring and slightly more like a place she was choosing to be, and that distinction, small as it was, mattered. The mediation office was on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown, neutral territory, as agreed belonging to neither attorney's firm, run by a mediator named Paul Schaefer, who had white hair and a deliberately unremarkable manner, and the focused patience of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people said things they couldn't take back. Claire arrived 7 minutes early. She wore a charcoal suit she had bought for a board presentation 2 years ago. Not her most expensive suit, but a good one, structured and clean. She had slept 6 hours the night before, which was not ideal but was sufficient. She had eaten breakfast, She had not taken anything for the tension headache that had been sitting at the base of her skull since Sunday, because she wanted to be fully present for whatever was about to happen. Rachel was already in the conference room when Claire arrived, standing at the window with a coffee in her hand, reviewing something on her tablet. She turned when Claire came in and looked at her with the same clinical directness she'd had since the first phone call at 11:30 p.m. in the Aldwyn. "Ready?" Rachel asked. "Yes," Claire said. "Gretchen's preliminary report came in this morning," Rachel said. "I have it here. The final number she's working with, accounting for all identifiable financial misconduct and misappropriation over the course of the marriage, is $287,000. That's up from the initial $240,000. Claire absorbed this without expression. What accounts for the difference? She found a pattern in the investment account, small, consistent withdrawals over 4 years that were below the threshold for automatic review flags. They add up to roughly $47,000 across the period. Rachel paused. Nathan was patient about it, methodical, which is either going to help us or make a jury very uncomfortable, depending on how this proceeds. "It's going to help us," Claire said. "I think so too." Rachel set the tablet down. "Gerald is going to come in today with an offer. I want you to hear it without reacting." "I'm not going to react." "I know you think that. I'm saying it anyway." Rachel looked at her steadily. "These sessions, even when you're the wronged party, even when the documentation is on your side, have a way of getting to people. Gerald is going to try to reframe the narrative. He's going to make Nathan sound reasonable and make the financial issue sound like a complex and mutual misunderstanding. He is very good at his job." "So are you," Claire said. "Yes," Rachel agreed without false modesty, "but I want you ready for the moment when Nathan looks at you across the table, because he will." They came in at 9:15. Gerald Fitch was older than Claire expected, mid-60s, silver-haired, the unhurried confidence of a man who had been in too many of these rooms to be impressed by any of them. He shook Rachel's hand and nodded at Claire with the specific professional courtesy that attorneys deployed to convey respect without warmth. Nathan came in behind him. He looked different than he had in the kitchen 5 days ago. Not worse exactly, but altered. The kind of subtle shift in a person's appearance that happens when they're not sleeping well and are carrying something they haven't found a place to put down. He had shaved and he was in a suit, and he carried himself with the practiced evenness he always carried himself with in professional settings. But his eyes, when they found Claire across the conference table, had a quality she hadn't seen in them before. Not guilt. Something adjacent to it, but more complicated. The look of a person who has seen how their own story lands from the outside and found the view unpleasant. He sat down. She looked at him for a moment, then looked away. Paul Schaefer opened the session with a brief description of process. This was not a legal proceeding. Participation was voluntary. The goal was to explore the possibility of a mutually acceptable resolution. He spoke in the measured tone of someone who had said these exact words many times, and had learned that the measured tone itself was part of the function. Gerald opened for Nathan's side. He was good. Claire had expected him to be good, and he was good. He laid out a narrative with the practiced ease of someone who understood that the first story told in a room sets the frame for everything that follows. His version was one of a marriage that had run its course. Two people who had grown in different directions, a financial situation that was genuinely complex given the intertwined nature of their accounts over 14 years, and a husband who had handled the transition poorly but had not acted with malicious intent. He used the word informality 3 times. He used the phrase marital financial complexity twice. He did not use the word fraud. When Gerald finished, Rachel opened a folder on the table in front of her and said, very calmly, "I'd like to introduce some documentation." She slid packets across the table to Paul Schaefer and to Gerald, printed, tabbed, organized, with the meticulous clarity that Gretchen Howell had built into every document she produced. "This is a forensic financial analysis of the marital accounts over the duration of the marriage," Rachel said. "It was conducted by Gretchen Howell, a certified forensic accountant with 20 years of experience in marital financial cases. The analysis identifies $287,000 in funds that were misappropriated, redirected, or expended without the primary account holder's knowledge or consent for Mr. Cole's personal benefit." She paused. "That figure includes, but is not limited to, $94,000 spent on an event held last Thursday at the Aldwyn Hotel. It also includes a $47,000 pattern of systematic small withdrawals from a joint investment account over 4 years." Gerald had opened the packet. He was reading without expression, which was its own expression. Nathan was looking at the packet without touching it. It also includes, Rachel continued, documentation of a residential lease on the Upper East Side maintained by Mr. Cole for the past 18 months at a cost of approximately $50,000 over the lease term. The lease is attached as Exhibit C. The room was very quiet. Paul Schaefer was making notes. Gerald was still reading. Nathan's eyes had moved from the packet to a fixed point on the conference table about 18 inches in front of him. Claire looked at her hands. Then Gerald looked up and said, "These figures are characterized as misappropriation. My client's position is that the financial arrangements in this marriage were informal and mutually understood." "By whom?" Rachel asked. Gerald looked at her. "My client had no knowledge of the Upper East Side apartment," Rachel said. "She had no knowledge that her investment account was being systematically drawn down. She had no knowledge that her business account was being used to fund an event for another woman. Which part of that does your client characterize as mutually understood?" A pause. "The nature of their financial arrangement." The nature of their financial arrangement was that Claire Bennett earned the majority of the marital income, and Nathan Cole was a secondary user on accounts she maintained. The documentation is consistent on this point across 14 years. Rachel closed her folder. "I want to be direct, Gerald. We are prepared to pursue this as a civil financial fraud case and to refer the criminal elements to the appropriate authorities. What we are here today to discuss is whether there is a resolution that avoids that process, but the resolution needs to reflect the actual scale of what occurred." Another silence. Paul Schaefer looked at Gerald. "Does your client want to take a brief recess?" Gerald looked at Nathan. Nathan looked up from the table. He looked at Gerald first, then, slowly, at Claire. She met his eyes and held them and did not look away. "Give us 10 minutes, Nathan said. They used the smaller conference room across the hall. Claire stood at the window while Rachel sat at the table and made notes. The view from the 32nd floor was the particular Manhattan view that looked like the city had been organized by someone who cared about composition, the geometry of rooftops and water towers, and the occasional glint of something reflective in the mid-morning sun. "He's going to make an offer," Rachel said, not looking up from her notes. "What do you think it is?" "He's going to offer to settle fast. Full financial restitution on the documented amounts, favorable division of the apartment equity, a clean and private divorce." She paused. "Gerald probably told him before today that the 287 number was likely to be in our documentation and that fighting it forensically was going to be expensive and uncertain. He'll want this closed." "And the legal consequences?" "Civil settlement won't preclude criminal referral. We keep that option open." "I want to keep it open," Claire said. "I know." Rachel set down her pen. "How are you doing? And I mean right now, in this room." Claire thought about it honestly for a moment. "Steady," she said finally, "which surprises me a little." "It shouldn't. You've been preparing for this for 11 days. "I've been preparing for this for 14 years, Claire said. "I just didn't know it." Rachel looked at her for a moment, then went back to her notes. They went back across the hall when Paul Schaefer knocked. Gerald Fitch made the offer. It was, as Rachel had predicted, a settlement offer, structured, comprehensive, clearly prepared in advance of this meeting, which meant Nathan had understood even before walking in today that the documentation was going to be what it was. The offer included full repayment of the $287,000 identified in Gretchen's report, a division of the apartment that left Claire with 80% of the equity, full coverage of legal fees, and a clean no-contest divorce filing within 30 days. In exchange, Claire would agree not to pursue criminal referral and would sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement. Rachel listened to the entire offer without interrupting. When Gerald finished, she said, "We'll need to discuss." Paul Schaefer suggested a lunch recess. In the elevator down to the lobby, Rachel said quietly, "It's a reasonable offer." "I know," Claire said. "The non-disparagement clause is the piece I want to push on. The way it's currently framed, it would restrict you from discussing what happened in any public forum. That includes, depending on interpretation, speaking to journalists, speaking to professional contacts, or publicly correcting any narrative Nathan or his representatives put forward." "He gets to shape the story," Claire said. "In a broad sense. Yes." They found a table at a deli 2 blocks from the building and ordered sandwiches. Neither of them was particularly hungry for, and sat across from each other and talked through the parameters carefully, the way they had done since the first morning in the Aldwyn Lounge. "What are the options on the non-disparagement?" Claire asked. We counter with a narrower scope, restrict it to specific factual claims rather than general discussion. Or we push for a unilateral version. He doesn't disparage you, you retain the right to speak honestly about your own experience. He'll reject the unilateral version. Probably, but it's worth the ask. Rachel took a bite of her sandwich and chewed thoughtfully. There's something else I want to raise, and I want you to think about it practically, not emotionally. Go ahead. The criminal referral option. If we retain it as leverage, but leverage has diminishing returns over time. If we don't use it, and he knows we're not going to use it, it stops being leverage. She looked at Claire directly. Do you actually want to pursue a criminal case against Nathan? Not as a threat, as an actual legal action. Claire was quiet for a moment. This was the question she had been circling around for 11 days. The documentation was there, the pattern was there. Gretchen had built a picture that any prosecutor with a financial crimes background would find compelling. The question was not whether the case existed. The question was what she wanted the next 2 years of her life to look like. A criminal case meant more time, more exposure, more of her bandwidth directed at Nathan, at the man who had taken enough of her time and bandwidth already. It meant depositions and court dates and the particular grinding endurance required of anyone who pursued legal action against someone who had the resources to fight it. And it meant keeping Nathan in the center of her life longer than he deserved to be there. No, she said finally, not as an active pursuit, but I want the non-disparagement clause narrowed and I want it reciprocal, and I want the settlement agreement to include a specific acknowledgement of the financial misconduct. Rachel raised an eyebrow. He's not going to want to sign an acknowledgement. I know. It exposes him in civil terms even after the settlement. I know that too, Claire said, but I'm not signing away my right to tell my own story in exchange for a clean deal unless he acknowledges what actually happened. Not in legal language that softens it into financial informality. In plain language. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. You know this might blow up the settlement, she said. Yes. And you're prepared for that? I'm prepared for a lot of things, Claire said. I've been preparing for a lot of things for a long time without knowing it. They went back upstairs. Rachel laid out the counterposition methodically, the narrowed non-disparagement, the reciprocal scope, and the acknowledgement clause. Gerald's expression when she reached the acknowledgement clause was the expression of a man who had anticipated most of the counters, but not quite this one. He asked for another recess. This one was 20 minutes. When they reconvened, Gerald said that his client was willing to accept the narrowed non-disparagement with reciprocal scope. He was not willing to sign an acknowledgement of financial misconduct as drafted. What would he sign? Rachel asked. Gerald slid a paper across the table. It was a counter-language proposal. 3 sentences, carefully constructed, in the particular style of legal language that means something specific while appearing to mean something general. Rachel read it, passed it to Claire. Claire read it. It said, the parties acknowledge that financial decisions made during the marriage were not always communicated with sufficient clarity, and that this lack of clarity contributed to a breakdown of trust. She set the paper down. She looked at Nathan. He was looking at the table again. But something about the set of his jaw was different from earlier in the morning. The careful, controlled evenness had slipped slightly, the way things slip when a person has been holding them for too long. Nathan, Claire said. He looked up. She hadn't planned to speak directly to him. That hadn't been the plan. But she found herself talking before she'd decided to. I'm not asking you to perform remorse, she said. I'm not asking you to apologize in a room with lawyers. I'm asking you to let the record be accurate. She kept her voice level, not hard, just clear. You spent my money. You maintained a second life. You told me I wasn't invited to your wedding while I was still your wife. Those things happened. I am not going to sign a document that describes those things as a lack of clarity. The room was very quiet. Gerald started to speak. Nathan raised a hand slightly, the small gesture he used in courtrooms to pause someone mid-sentence. Gerald stopped. Nathan looked at Claire. Something moved across his face. Not the calculated repositioning she'd watched him do in the kitchen, not the deposition steadiness he'd deployed across the mediation table all morning. Something underneath all of that. Briefer and less polished. What do you want the language to say? He asked. Rachel glanced at Claire. Claire kept her eyes on Nathan. That you used marital accounts without consent, she said. That the funds were directed toward personal expenses outside the marriage. That the amounts are accurately represented in the forensic report. She paused. 3 sentences. Accurate ones. A long silence. Gerald leaned toward Nathan and said something quietly. Nathan listened, didn't respond. Then he said to Claire, "All right." Gerald looked at him sharply. "All right," Nathan said again, to Gerald this time, and there was something in his voice, flat and final, that sounded less like a legal strategy and more like a man who was simply, finally, too tired to hold the shape of something that no longer held. Gerald produced a legal pad and wrote the counterlanguage. It took 4 drafts over the next 40 minutes, Rachel and Gerald going back and forth across the table with careful professional precision until the language was what it was supposed to be: accurate, unambiguous, signed off on by Paul Schaefer as consistent with the settlement terms. Nathan signed it. Claire signed it. The settlement itself took another hour to finalize. The financial restitution schedule, the apartment equity terms, the divorce filing timeline. All of it handled by Rachel and Gerald, while Claire sat and watched the process with the detached attention of someone observing something necessary. When it was done, Paul Schaefer collected the documents and said what mediators said at the end of sessions. Gerald packed his briefcase. He did not look particularly satisfied, which was the sign of a mediation that had gone more or less appropriately. Nathan stood and buttoned his jacket and looked at Claire one more time. She waited. "I'm sorry," he said. It was quiet, almost inaudible. She looked at him. She thought about whether she believed him. She thought it was probably true in the limited way that certain apologies are true. Not regret for having done something, exactly, but regret for having been caught in the particular way that made the consequences what they were. "I know," she said. Not "it's okay," not "I forgive you," just she knew because she did. He left. She and Rachel sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes after the others had gone. Rachel was assembling documents into her bag. Claire was sitting at the table looking at the middle distance. "You okay?" Rachel asked. "Yeah," Claire said. She thought about it more carefully. "Yeah, actually." "The acknowledgement clause was a good call," Rachel said. "I wasn't sure he'd sign it." "I was," Claire said, and she had been, though she couldn't have fully articulated why. Something about the look on his face in the kitchen when he'd said, "I didn't think you'd fight." Something about a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that certain people would remain in the places he'd assigned them. When the assignment was finally and irrevocably refused, there was sometimes, underneath the defense mechanisms, a version of relief. Not for what had been lost, but for the end of the maintenance of it. She picked up her bag. In the elevator, Rachel said, "Divorce filing goes to the court Monday. Should be finalized in 30 to 45 days, depending on the calendar." "Okay." "And Claire?" Rachel looked at her as the doors opened onto the lobby. "For what it's worth, and I don't say this to many clients because it's usually not true, you handled this as well as it's possible to handle something like this." Claire stepped out into the lobby. "I had a good attorney," she said. Rachel almost smiled. "Yes, you did." Outside, the afternoon was clear and cool, the kind of October afternoon that felt like the city was taking a breath between seasons. Claire stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the air move over her and did not think about anything in particular. Her phone buzzed. "Diane, just landed at LaGuardia. Be there in an hour. Do you need anything?" Claire looked at the message. She thought about the apartment waiting for her. Hers, fully hers. Now in every sense the settlement had just made clear. She thought about the document she had closed last Sunday without reopening. She thought about what it would feel like to sit across a kitchen table from her sister and not perform anything, not manage anything, not make the face she made in difficult rooms. She typed back, "Just come. That's enough." She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the subway. Around her, the city moved at its usual indifferent pace. People with places to go, cabs with someone somewhere to get to, the general machinery of a million separate lives running simultaneously without acknowledgement of each other. She was one of them. She had always been one of them, even when she'd been doing the work of 2 people, carrying the weight of someone else's performance alongside her own. She would not be doing that anymore. The thought arrived without drama, without the weight she might have expected. Just a quiet fact, like a number that finally balances, true, verifiable, and solid enough to stand on. She went down the stairs into the subway and let the train take her home. Diane arrived at 6:15 with a rolling suitcase and a bag of groceries she had apparently bought at a market near the airport, which struck Claire as such a specific and practical form of love that she almost laughed when she opened the door. "I didn't know what you had," Diane said, by way of explanation, moving past her into the kitchen and beginning to unpack things onto the counter. Pasta, 2 kinds of sauce, a wedge of cheese, a bottle of wine, bread. I figured either you've been eating well and this is extra, or you've been eating like someone going through a crisis, which means you've been eating crackers and forgetting about it. Crackers and forgetting about it, Claire confirmed. Thought so. Diane looked around the kitchen and then looked at Claire. A direct, full-face look, the kind only people who have known you your whole life feel entitled to. You look tired. I am tired. But not broken. No, Claire said, not broken. Diane nodded once, like this was information she'd been waiting to confirm, and now that she had it, she could move forward. She turned back to the counter and started water boiling and opened the wine and found 2 glasses without asking where they were, because she had been in this kitchen enough times to know. And Claire sat at the table and watched her sister move through the space with the ease of someone who understood that the most useful thing you could do for a person in a specific kind of pain was to simply be present and feed them. Tell me what happened, Diane said, her back still turned. The whole thing, don't summarize. So Claire told her. She told it from the beginning, the delayed flight, the carry-on, the Aldwin's lobby, the music she heard from the hallway, the sign with gold lettering, Nathan's face when he saw her across the room. She told it without the professional distance she'd maintained through 11 days of attorney calls and forensic accounting sessions and mediation rooms. She told it the way you tell a story to someone who has known you since you were 8 years old and is standing at your stove making pasta at 6:30 on a Thursday evening, which is to say, she told it honestly. Diane did not interrupt. She stirred and poured wine and set a glass in front of Claire and listened. When Claire finished, Diane sat down across from her. 2 years and 3 months, Diane said. At least, that's what the emails show. The full picture might be longer. And you had no idea. It wasn't a question, but Claire answered it anyway. I had feelings I didn't follow up on, she said. Things that didn't quite add up when I looked at them directly, so I stopped looking directly. She paused. That's different from having no idea. That's having an idea and deciding the cost of finding out was too high. Diane looked at her. You're not going to let yourself off the hook for that, Diane said. It wasn't a question either. I'm trying to be accurate about it, Claire said. There's a version of this story where I was completely blindsided and nothing was my responsibility and I was purely a victim. And that version is easier, but it's not completely true. I made choices that made this easier for him. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I covered gaps without demanding accountability because I didn't want the confrontation. Claire, Diane said it quietly, trusting your husband isn't a character flaw. Ignoring the evidence that the trust is misplaced might be. You don't know that you ignored it. You might have just not seen it. I know the difference between not seeing something and not wanting to see it, Claire said. And I think I owe myself enough honesty to admit which one it was. Diane was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly on the table. Okay, she said finally. And what do you do with that? I learn from it, Claire said. That's all you can do with it. That's it? That's the whole lesson? That's the one that matters. Claire took a drink of her wine. Everything else, the anger, the grief, the hours at 3 a.m, running through the timeline looking for the exact moment I should have known. All of that is real, and I'm going to feel all of it. But the thing I actually need to carry forward is, I am allowed to ask questions. I am allowed to want accountability from the people who say they're my partners. Wanting that is not distrust. It's not being difficult. It's just being a full participant in my own life. Diane looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this a lot, she said. I've had 11 days and very little sleep. Diane almost smiled. Fair. She got up to check the pasta. The apartment is yours? Settlement gives me 80% of the equity. I'll buy out the remaining portion. It'll take some restructuring, but it's manageable. And the money he took? Repayment schedule in the settlement. It'll come back over time. Claire paused. Not all of it. Some of what he took can't be quantified in a spreadsheet. Time. Bandwidth. Years of just carrying more than my share and calling it partnership. That part doesn't come back, Diane said. No, Claire agreed. That part you just have to decide what to do with. They ate at the kitchen table. Pasta that was a little overcooked, which neither of them commented on, with the bread and the cheese and the wine, and talked about other things for a while, the kind of other things that people talk about when they need to let a heavy subject breathe. Diane's job, a renovation she was considering in her Philadelphia house. A mutual friend who had recently done something inadvisable with someone she worked with. Ordinary things. Claire found herself grateful for them in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The way you're grateful for ordinary things specifically when you've spent 11 days living entirely inside a crisis. At some point after 10, Diane fell asleep on the couch with a book she'd pulled from Claire's shelf, and Claire turned off the living room light and left her there and went to bed. She slept 7 hours without waking. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in November, 41 days after the mediation. Rachel called Claire at 10:14 in the morning to tell her, and Claire was sitting at her desk at work. She had been back in the office for 3 weeks, moving through the ordinary rhythms of her job with the specific gratitude of someone who has spent time unable to think about anything except one thing and is now permitted to think about something else. "It's done," Rachel said. "The court accepted the filing. You're legally divorced as of this morning." Claire said, "Thank you, Rachel, for everything." "That's what I'm here for." A brief pause. "What are you doing tonight?" "Working late, probably. I have a board deck due Friday." "Go home at a reasonable hour," Rachel said, with the particular directness she used when she meant something. "The board deck will exist tomorrow." Claire smiled at her desk. "Okay." "And Claire." Rachel's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more personal, the way it got when she was speaking as something other than an attorney. "I've been doing this a long time. I've sat across from a lot of people in a lot of difficult situations. The way you handled this, from the first call at 11:30 at night to the mediation table, so it was one of the cleaner pieces of work I've seen. And I don't mean clean in the legal sense. I mean you stayed clear about who you were through the whole thing. That's not as common as you'd think." Claire held the phone for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." She sat at her desk after the call and looked out the window at the November sky, which was the specific gray of New York in late autumn, flat and low, and not unpleasant if you didn't expect it to be anything other than what it was. It was done. She turned back to her computer and opened the board deck. The professional consequences for Nathan arrived more slowly than the personal ones, but they arrived. The acknowledgement clause in the settlement was not, as Gerald Fitch had correctly predicted, something that could be fully contained. The language was specific enough. Marital accounts accessed without consent, funds directed toward personal expenses outside the marriage. That when the settlement document became part of the public divorce record, which it did because Claire had not agreed to seal it, any journalist or professional contact who pulled the record could read it clearly. Several did. Claire did not talk to the press. She had not changed her position on that. She had no interest in a media story about her marriage or her divorce. But she was also not responsible for what was available in a public court record, and she was not responsible for the professional community's ability to read. Nathan had been in conversation with 2 firms about a partnership track position. Both conversations quietly ended. A referral network he had been part of for several years, a loose consortium of attorneys and financial professionals who directed clients to each other, sent him a letter in December indicating that his membership was not being renewed. He was not arrested. He was not prosecuted. The settlement had closed that door and Claire had agreed to close it, and she did not regret that choice even when people, Diane, occasionally, a colleague who knew the broad outlines of what had happened, suggested that perhaps he had gotten away with something. She had thought about this carefully and had arrived at a position she was comfortable with. Nathan had not gotten away clean. Getting away clean would have required that nothing changed, that he married Vivian Hart in the grand ballroom of the Aldwyn on a Thursday night and went to work on Friday, and no one adjusted their assessment of him. That had not happened. The professional community he'd operated in for 2 decades now understood, in the specific way that professional communities understand things without anyone making a formal announcement, what he had done. The financial consequences were real and significant. The reputation he had spent 20 years building had a fracture running through it now that no amount of careful behavior would fully repair. That was not nothing. And pursuing a criminal case, 2 more years of her attention, her bandwidth, her capacity, all directed at a man who had already taken enough of those things, was a cost she had not been willing to pay for the satisfaction of a more dramatic consequence. She had enough of her own life to build. In January, her company promoted her. It was not a surprise to the people who worked with her. Her track record was what it was. And the work she had done on the corporate restructuring the previous year had been the kind of work that made the conversations that led to promotions inevitable. But the timing of it, 4 months after the worst period of her adult life, had a particular quality that she did not try to make meaningful in a cosmic sense. It was just good timing. Sometimes good things happened at the right moment, not because of some underlying order to events, but simply because they happened to coincide. Her new title was Chief Financial Officer. The conversation with her CEO, a woman named Patricia Huang, who had been in the industry for 30 years and who said exactly what she meant and expected the same in return, was brief and direct. "This has been coming for a while," Patricia said, across a conference table on the 44th floor. "You know that." "I had a sense," Claire said. "The board asked me specifically about your situation, the personal situation from this fall." Claire held Patricia's gaze. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "I told them that how a person handles a crisis tells you more about their capabilities than how they handle success, and that based on what I'd observed over the last 4 months, I had more confidence in you now than I did before." Patricia paused. "Which is saying something, because I had a lot of confidence in you before." Claire sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Do the job." Patricia slid a folder across the table. "The compensation package is in there. If you have questions, have your attorney review it." Claire almost said, "I have a good attorney," and thought of Rachel and allowed herself a small private moment. "I will," she said. "Bassem." She called Diane that evening from the apartment. "CFO," Diane said when Claire told her. "CFO," Claire confirmed. "Well, a beat. I want to say something without it sounding like a cliché. You can try." "You spent 14 years making someone else look successful," Diane said. "And the year you stopped doing that, you got promoted to the top financial position at your company." She paused. "I'm not saying one caused the other. I'm just saying the bandwidth you were spending on him went somewhere." Claire stood at the window of her apartment, wholly and entirely, the buyout completed in December, and looked out at the January street. "I've thought about," she said, "about how much of myself was going into that marriage. Not in the obvious ways, not just the money. The mental space, the management of his feelings about his career and his position and whether he felt respected. I spent so much time managing the ecosystem around him that I didn't notice how little space was left for anything else. And now? Now I have a very large apartment that echoes slightly," Claire said, "and a job that is going to be extraordinarily demanding, and for the first time in a long time, I'm going to have to figure out who I am when I'm not organizing myself around another person." "Is that scary?" Claire thought about it honestly. "A little," she said, "but it's the right kind of scary, the kind that means something is actually different." February. She went to a dinner party at a colleague's apartment, not something she would have done in the previous year, when her social life had been organized largely around Nathan's professional engagements and the particular social obligations that attended being the less visible half of a two-person unit. She went alone and knew almost no one, and had 3 conversations that surprised her with how interesting they were. A woman who designed infrastructure systems for cities, who talked about load-bearing capacity in a way that applied, Claire thought, to more than buildings. A man who had recently returned from 2 years abroad and had the particular quality of someone who had learned to sit comfortably in uncertainty. A couple who had been together for 30 years and who bickered over a minor detail about a restaurant they'd been to in 1998 with the easy familiarity of people who had no performance left in their relationship. She drove home. She had started driving again, had bought a used car in January because she felt like it, no calculation, just because she wanted one, and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before going inside. She was not the same person who had stood in the corridor of the Aldwyn Hotel 4 months ago with a carry-on in her hand and watched her husband prepare to marry someone else. Not entirely. Something had shifted in the architecture of how she understood herself, and she was still locating the edges of that shift, still finding new angles where the light came through differently. She thought about something her colleague Diane, her sister, she corrected herself, her mind sometimes merged the two Dianes, had said during one of their calls in November. The person who absorbs everything without demanding anything becomes invisible. Not to others, necessarily, to themselves. Claire had absorbed a great deal. She had absorbed financial shortfalls and career disappointments, and the slow erosion of a partnership that had been, for a long time, genuinely one-sided in ways she hadn't named. She had absorbed it and called it loyalty and called it love, and sometimes it had been both of those things. But over the years, it had also become a habit, the habit of making space, of shrinking requirements, of asking less than she was owed because asking felt like weakness, and she had not wanted to be weak. What she understood now, and what had taken something this catastrophic to force into clarity, was that asking for what you deserved was not weakness. It was the most basic form of self-respect. It was the thing that told the people in your life, and you yourself, that you believed you were worth accounting for. She had stopped believing that somewhere in the middle years of her marriage, quietly, without noticing, the way you stop noticing a slow change in the quality of light. She was noticing now, Shab. In March, Vivian Hart called. Claire almost didn't answer. It was a number she didn't recognize, and she usually let unknown numbers go to voicemail. But something, instinct, curiosity, the particular sense she'd developed over months of living in the aftermath of a situation that kept producing unexpected angles, made her answer. "This is Vivian Hart," the woman said. Her voice was steadier than Claire would have expected. Not confident exactly, but composed in a way that suggested she had decided what she was going to say and had decided to say it. Claire sat down. "Vivian," she said. A brief silence. "I wanted to call earlier. I've been trying to figure out what I would say." "What did you decide?" "I decided I wasn't going to try to explain myself," Vivian said, "because I don't think anything I say about my perspective on that relationship it's not what matters. What matters is that I didn't know you existed, not as a real person. He talked about you, past tense, always past tense. He told me the divorce was in process, that it had been in process for over a year." Claire was quiet. "I know that's not an excuse," Vivian said. "I know I could have asked more questions. I could have verified. I didn't, because I believed him, and because I wanted to believe him, and I've spent the last 4 months sitting with what that means about me." A pause. "I'm not calling to ask for your forgiveness. I wanted you to know that I wasn't a knowing participant in what he did to you." Claire looked at the far wall of her living room. She thought about Vivian in the ivory dress, the dark hair, the diamonds at her throat, the hand resting on Nathan's arm with easy familiarity. She had tried in the aftermath to feel something clean and simple about Vivian. Anger, contempt, the focused resentment that would have made the picture tidier. She hadn't managed it, partly because the evidence suggested Vivian had been deceived as thoroughly as she had, in different ways, and partly because she was trying, in this new chapter of her life, to be honest about where the actual wrongdoing lived and to not distribute it more widely than it belonged. The wrongdoing lived with Nathan. That was where it had always lived. "I believe you," Claire said. Another silence, longer. "How are you doing?" Vivian asked. It came out quietly, like she hadn't planned to ask it, but it came anyway. "Better," Claire said. "Actually better, not just saying it." She paused. "You?" "Working on it," Vivian said. "That's the honest answer," Claire said. They were quiet for a moment, two women on a phone in March, connected by a man who had performed love for both of them simultaneously and called it managing his life. "I'm sorry," Vivian said finally, not explaining it, just saying it. "I know," Claire said, and she did. She knew the apology was genuine, and she knew it was insufficient, and she knew those two things were not contradictory. "Take care of yourself, Vivian." "You too," Vivian said. Claire set the phone down. She sat with the call for a while, not analyzing it, not adding it to any framework, just letting it exist as a thing that had happened. Vivian Hart was a real person who had been deceived by the same man for her own reasons and in her own way, and was now living in the aftermath of that, the same as Claire, with different details. There was no tidiness to it. There was just the mess that one person's deliberate deception made when it finally stopped being containable, and all the different people who had to sort through the wreckage, and the long work of figuring out what you wanted to do with the rest of the days ahead. Spring arrived the way it arrived in New York, which was without elegance. 1 week cold and gray, the next startlingly bright, then cold again, then warm for real. The trees along the side streets going from bare to full in what seemed like a single weekend. Claire noticed this in a way she hadn't noticed seasonal changes in years. She wasn't sure whether that was a function of the newness of everything, or simply that she had more available attention now and was directing it outward. She was running again. She had run in her 30s and had stopped without deciding to, the way you stop doing things when the available hours collapse under the weight of a life that keeps demanding more of them. She started again in February, set first a few blocks, then a mile, then enough that she had to buy proper shoes for it instead of the vague approximation of running shoes she'd been using. She ran in the mornings along the park before work and found it useful the same way organizing numbers was useful. It gave her a task that required exactly the amount of attention it required, no more, and the simplicity of that was, for 1 hour a day, a relief. Her body was not perfectly suited to running and had never pretended to be. Her left knee was cranky. Her breathing was less efficient than she'd like. She was slower than she used to be and would likely never be as fast as she'd been at 31, and none of that particularly bothered her because she was not running toward anything or away from anything. She was just moving, which was, she was discovering, its own sufficient reason. Nathan, she learned through the ordinary channels of a professional world that was smaller than it seemed, had left New York in April. He had taken a position, not a partnership, a salaried position, at a mid-sized firm in Connecticut. The move was not announced, not the kind of career change that generated any kind of professional notice. He simply stopped being visible in the New York legal community and was, through the standard process of absence, gradually absorbed into the past tense. Claire heard this from a mutual acquaintance, a man they had both known for years, who told her with the specific, careful neutrality of someone delivering information they weren't sure how to characterize. "How do you feel about that?" the man asked. She thought about it honestly. "Nothing particular," she said. "I hope he does all right." The man looked at her like this was a more complicated answer than he'd expected. She meant it, though, not as performance, not as the magnanimous statement of someone who wanted to appear unaffected. She genuinely, when she examined the question, found that what she felt about Nathan's situation was something close to indifference, not the cold, aggressive indifference of someone who had buried their feelings, but the simple indifference of someone who had moved far enough in a different direction that another person's circumstances had become, simply, not very relevant to her own. It had taken longer than she expected to reach that feeling, and shorter than she feared. In May, she stood in the lobby of the Aldwyn. She had a meeting with a client whose company was throwing a dinner at the hotel that evening, and she had arrived 20 minutes early, which was her habit, and she stood in the lobby and looked at it. The dark wood, the low lighting, the leather chairs, the flowers that cost more than groceries. She had stood in this lobby 7 months ago with a carry-on and jet lag, and a life she was about to find out had been constructed differently than she believed. She stood in it now as the chief financial officer of a company she had spent 16 years building a place in, as a woman living alone in an apartment that was wholly and legally hers, as a person who had spent the winter doing the unglamorous work of learning how to be single again at 44, which was different from being single at 25 in every way that mattered and had required her to rebuild certain assumptions about her own life from the ground up, which she was still doing, which she would likely be doing for some time, and which was, she had come to understand, not a problem to be solved, but a process to be lived. The lobby looked the same. Hotels always looked the same. She was not the same. She did not find this moment cinematic or redemptive. She did not feel, standing in the lobby of the Aldwyn on a Tuesday evening in May, that anything had come full circle or been resolved into meaning. Life did not, in her experience, resolve into meaning on its own. It generated experience and then required you to make sense of it yourself, with whatever tools you had, over whatever amount of time it actually took, without the benefit of a score or a closing shot. What she felt was something quieter and more durable than meaning. She felt like herself, not the self she'd been before. The self that had learned to make space, to absorb, to smooth things over, and keep the architecture standing at the cost of her own full presence within it. A different self. One that was still figuring out its edges, still learning what it asked for and what it refused, still discovering what it was like to occupy her own life as the primary and not the supporting consideration. That self was not finished being built. She was not sure a self ever was. But it was hers. Entirely, accountably, irrevocably hers. Not in the way you claim something out of defiance, but in the way you recognize something that was always true and finally stopped looking away from. Her phone buzzed. Her client, confirming the dinner location. She wrote back, tucked the phone into her bag, and crossed the lobby toward the event space. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who knew where she was going. There is something that people who have survived a specific kind of betrayal often don't get to say because the story ends in the wrong place. It ends at the wound and not at what the wound became. Claire Bennett's story could have ended in a hotel corridor with a man saying you're not invited and a woman walking away in silence. That was a real ending. It happened. She lived inside it for a moment that felt much longer than a moment, but she kept going past it, not because she was extraordinary, not because she had access to some reservoir of strength that other people lacked. She kept going because she was stubborn and practical, and because she had a good attorney and a sister who showed up with groceries and a job that required her to be present, and because underneath all of it, she had never fully stopped believing that she was worth the accounting. She had just temporarily, for too long, let someone else's account override her own. The correction was painful in the way that most corrections are painful. Not clean, not cinematic, full of nights she didn't sleep well, and days she was less than graceful about things, and moments when she ran the tape backward and found angles of herself that were uncomfortable to examine. Full of the ordinary difficulty of rebuilding, which is less dramatic than falling apart and more important. She had been a person who covered gaps without demanding accountability because demanding felt like weakness. She was becoming a person who understood that asking for what you deserve is not weakness. It is the exact opposite of weakness. It is the most clarifying form of self-knowledge. The knowledge that you exist, fully and specifically, and that your existence has requirements, and that those requirements are legitimate and worth stating. She did not learn this easily. She did not learn it without cost. But she learned it. And she carried it forward in the way that real things are carried, not as a speech or a revelation, but as a quiet, permanent change in the way she moved through rooms and asked questions and refused to accept the accounting of people who needed her to be less than she was in order for their own story to add up. There is no clean moral to a story like this. The man who deceived her was not destroyed by justice. He was diminished by consequence, which is different. The woman he tried to erase was not defined by the erasure, which took work, which required time, which was not finished. The work is never finished. That is not a tragedy. That is just what living actually looks like from the inside when you're doing it honestly. Claire Bennett was doing it honestly. That was enough. That, in the end, was everything.